everyone, it's Casey. So welcome back to this mini series, I suppose, about how I found a job in Taiwan and my experience. Again, quick disclaimer, this is only my experience, so take it as just one person's opinion or experience, I suppose. So as you can see from the title, today I'm going to talk about contracts, working part-time or full-time for one place, and teaching kids versus adults. So let's just jump straight into it. For myself, I work with mostly, I call them young adults to adults. And I work part-time in a couple of different places. Again, I'm not going to talk about where I work for privacy reasons. And I honestly don't think it's helpful to mention which ones I work for, because just because I may find this place suitable for me, it may not be suitable for you, because personalities could clash and things like this. Now, obviously I have not worked under a full-time job before, and there are pros and cons, so I'll kind of weigh out both of these. Okay, so I'm just checking my notes here in case you're wondering why I'm looking down. But let's talk about contracts. Okay, from what I understand, I've never worked with technically a true time-based contract. Typically they will be 1 year or more when it comes to contracts. And I noticed that most of these contracts are obviously full-time, and most of them are for K to 12 type of cram schools, where they have large class sizes, things like this. The good news about these contracts is, of course, as you know, it's very stable. You have a secure job, things like this. You have a stable income, and typically it is salary based. So you're going to know what you will get each month. Now, regarding that, during my research, or based on what I've heard from some individuals, is sometimes, even though you're signing that contract, I've heard some people were threatened by their employer regarding their ARC, threatening to take it away, things like this. And basically, if they weren't satisfied with what you were doing, things like this. So I've never had that experience personally, but again, take it with a grain of salt. But can they do it? Probably. But then you could quickly find another place as well within that time. But yeah, I've heard basically some nightmare stories from cases where they have contracts and there's that pressure. I'll talk about time and effort as well. Another good thing about usually these contractual type of jobs, especially if it's K to 12, kindergarten to high school, is basically, typically you'll be teaching in the daytime, and it's usually from 8 in the morning to 5 p.m., somewhere in that range. So you'll have a more normal lifestyle compared to cram school teachers who work part-time and who work for older people like myself. So things like that. Now, regarding the salary, of course, in Taipei, it will be higher. And as you move more to the countryside, it will be lower. But of course, your cost of living will be much cheaper, things like this. Now, in regards to, what should you expect for your salary, you can probably find it online, especially for like locations such as Taipei. But honestly, the salary or even the wage doesn't change that much, because it's such a competitive field in Taiwan. From cram school to cram school, they really don't have that budget to give you a raise that often and things like this. So that's something to bear in mind. Is it a place or type of job where you'll see like a chance to get a raise frequently? Probably not, but it is arguably higher than most other jobs in Taiwan. The starting average salary or something like that is 22K in Taiwan, which is rather low. As you know, that probably wouldn't even sustain my apartment that I currently rent. So for us cram school teachers, we honestly can make a decent income comparably to other Taiwanese people. But compared to other countries, sure, working in our home country probably will earn us more money, but the lifestyle is much different, right? So I'll talk about teaching kids and adults in a second. um, Although you work from 8 to 5, okay, one thing to keep in mind is that does not include obviously working on your own time to prepare for lessons, to create games and lesson plans, things like this. So we're pretty much at least in the very beginning, you're going to do a lot of preparation work for sure. And that's something to bear in mind is although it is 8 to 5, I've heard some cram schools, especially for kids or K to 12, more so for elementary school, is you're going to have to think of sometimes like games or plays. Along the countryside, I've heard teachers even have to contact the parents of the kids and write progress reports and all these things. So uh, there is a good amount of outside work that they don't really mention. So whether you want to ask your employer or the person who's interviewing you about that, that's something you may want to consider if you want to do it. Whether it's a good idea to ask at such an early age or stage, I'm not sure, but just bear that in mind. Now, regarding working part-times, typically for most teachers will work 2 or more different cram schools or different locations. To be honest, coming from California, I feel like it's not a huge hassle to commute from one location to the next in Taiwan, to work multiple places. In a different regard, I think it's actually a little bit stable, if in the worst case scenario, and I imagine if you lose one ARC or one sponsor for your work visa, if you will, I think the other one will still be able to keep you or something like that. So working multiple places may not be a bad idea. But keep in mind, typically for part-time, and not always, once you start working with older kids to adults, you're going to be typically working in the evening. So our lifestyle is completely flipped from the majority of people. To make friends, it may be a little bit more difficult, things like that. And let's see, things like that. Typically, we'll have an hourly wage. Does it fluctuate a lot? Honestly, it doesn't fluctuate a whole lot, especially if you're doing group classes, things like this, because like I mentioned before, very competitive field. There's not a lot of give when it comes to giving a raise and things like this. So expect a rather stable income for a while. If you do stay progressively longer, like for 2 or more years, then you can expect a small raise, but is it a lot? Probably not compared to what we're used to in the West, but it's still a raise, still be appreciative about that. But another downside about part-time is, of course, it could be unstable. Now, I'll talk about, working one-on-one versus group classes. Sometimes, with part-time jobs, it could be very unstable because they might switch your schedule around and things like this. So sometimes you might lose classes and switch to a different time if you're not very flexible with your time. So the bigger time slots you give them to play with, the more classes you will have. And the more you're willing to commute to sometimes different locations, even different cities, the more hours you will have. But we definitely have to have even more flexibility and hours when it comes to part-time work. And aside from just working those hours, we also have to, of course, do a lot of lesson preparation, grading, emails, things like that. That is not included, obviously, when in your wage. So something to keep in mind. I would say after working a couple of years or even a few years, it starts getting a little bit better once you get used to that one place or a couple of places to get used to how to prepare. So it will get easier after, I would say, a year. So let's talk about teaching kids versus adults. So again, with kids, typically it's from kindergarten. A lot of kindergartens require, or they desire foreign teachers. And same thing with, elementary, things like this. I'm not sure about junior and high school. But typically with let's just stick to elementary school, is from what I hear is you'll have the foreign teacher, and you usually are accompanied with a Taiwanese local teacher, sometimes even up to two depending on the class size. I've heard class sizes could even sometimes get up to like over 30. Obviously, from what I understand, those pay a lot more compared to class sizes that are obviously smaller. Now, I've heard multiple things about teaching children. Of course, if you love children, that's going to be a huge bonus and you may love it. But, and I say this cautiously, is Taiwanese parents are very loving of their children here. So they don't really appreciate it if you discipline their child too strictly, if I could put it that way. So in certain cases, I have heard where some teachers have maybe yelled at the child or something in a more aggressive way or slightly a meaner way. Parents have complained to the school, and the school sometimes has to get rid of the teacher. So something to keep in mind is parents here are insanely protective of their children. I've heard about other Asian countries where they appreciate when the teacher disciplines their child, but in Taiwan, that's not really the case. But at the same time, I've also heard, some of my friends work near the countryside or closer to the countryside, and they've told me these children are like angels. They love listening to him. They love playing their games and things like this. So, something to just bear in mind is that from location to location, children and parents might be different. For example, in my mom's hometown, I hear the cram school teacher just yelling at these kids so loudly and so aggressively that even I'm scared just listening to it from outside. And I was standing like probably a few feet away, and I could hear her from outside screaming at these kids. And yet she was the most popular cram school teacher in my mom's hometown because, the parents in my mom's hometown do appreciate discipline. But now when it comes to, cities and things like that, I think parenting is very different in Taiwan, and you'll find out for yourself. It's not saying that teaching children is a bad idea or anything like that. It's just that be prepared to know you're going to deal with parents who will ask for more attention on their child and things like this. So in some cases, I heard some teachers have to grade the students' papers or something. But again, more commonly, I hear the Taiwanese teaching or assistants or TAs doing that. And I say this hesitantly, but in a way, in Taiwan, especially with these sort of like elementary cram schools, customers always write saying kind of strongly applies. And with complete understanding of this is that from what I hear is usually these bilingual type of cram schools for elementary students are ranging from like 20,000 per month. So parents are paying a ton of money to send their kids starting from kindergarten. So of course they pay 20,000 per month. So I totally expect them to have extremely high demands for their teachers. But of course, the one huge pro is that you're working with adorable children who will likely adore you and things like this. They probably really love asking questions and learning from you compared to working with adults who sometimes here and there may get difficult, right? So difficult in a different way, right? Kids are just sometimes a little naughty is all. So All right, so let's talk about working with adults. Pretty much you're always going to be in the evening. So the youngest student I've had was around junior high school. Um, so she was probably around like 14, 15. Probably is my youngest kid I've ever taught. And these are typically in group classes. I'll talk about one-on-one classes in a bit. But typically they're quite respectful. In the cram school I work for, it's basically a huge group class. I teach TOEFL and conversation, and the ages completely range from like 14, 15, all the way up to like 60s or even 70s, I think, in one case. Um, so you get a huge range. So I feel like the younger kids typically won't do too much, just because the adults are there to kind of keep an eye on them, to make sure they won't waste their time and money as well. When it comes to TOEFL, it's typically college students. There are some occasions where you have much older adults as well, but in terms of reputation, or not reputation, but respect or something like that, they're pretty okay. I have one time taught SATs, and the kids were like high school range. That to me was, some kids were great, don't get me wrong, but there were a few that were a handful. So, sometimes I prefer working with older adults, because, we could reason with them, things like this. And sometimes I really love my job to meet these kinds of people, even, teenagers as well, when they're more mature and they open up to me about their life, and they tell us how much we help them. And so it could be a very rewarding job. There are times where working with adults, I could learn about the business industry in Taiwan, which a lot of foreigners come here to do, as well as to learn about the market through their students themselves. And it's a win-win situation. They're practicing their English and their business conversation, and for us, we're learning about the market, things like this. So sometimes even I have very deep conversations about culture and ethnicity, being Asian American, things like this. So you get this huge range of discussions, whereas with children, sometimes we may lack a little bit. But I would say the demand for teaching adults may be a little bit lower in the countryside. You'll mostly see in bigger cities like Taipei or Hsinchu, where we have Science Park, or Taichung, where they also have a science park. So a lot of working people who work with international companies will need English skills. But outside of that, you won't really see adults needing, cram school teachers or one-on-one tutors, things like this. Typically with these adults, I also teach one-on-one. When I teach adults, they may ask about improving resumes, presentations, mostly about business. Sometimes even just only conversation, because they're very proficient when it comes to business language, but they don't have as much exposure to talking about their own thoughts and things like this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One thing I will say, one con when you teach one-on-one with adults is sometimes they won't do their homework, so you have to prepare materials for that event. If they don't do homework, all right, you're gonna have to start preparing this lesson, things like this. So as far as I believe, with the adults they might want to work on TOEIC, which is like a sort of like a business test. College students typically will do TOEFL or IELTS. In high school, obviously SATs, GREs, GMAT, things like that. So for both of these, for one-on-one, you're pretty much always going to do like lesson preparation for that specific individual. At least that's what I do. For group classes, once you have the foundation of teaching tests or exams, once you prepare for the materials at least once or twice, modifying for each lesson, there isn't much change. But when it comes to one-on-one, there's a lot more change going on, because it's sort of like catering to that specific student. So in terms of range, again, I'm not sure, but you could check online comparing other places or cities. Really doesn't change all that much. So hopefully that was helpful in regards to teaching kids or adults in contracts, wage or salary, things like that. If you have any further questions about it, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a good day, and thanks for watching. Bye, guys.